So first, let's talk about what a foundation model actually is, because I think this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And though we've heard a definition today, I want to just review this quickly because it gets to the heart of my point. So a foundation model, importantly, is a general model that is pre-trained on diverse data, not on a specific task. This is what distinguishes it from other models. Simply training a large neural network on lots of data does not make a foundation model. You know, the original image classifiers were trained on vast amounts of data, but they were trained on one task, classify images. They were not foundation models. The point of a foundation model is specifically that you are not pre-specifying in advance the task that you're going to learn with the model. Instead, you're training a general purpose system, usually on a very diverse array of data. So this could include multimodal data, to be clear, you know, images, text, video, audio, whatever. That's what we're seeing in the AI world right now, is models that combine all of these modalities. And furthermore, these models are pre-trained in a manner that doesn't specify the downstream task. The idea is instead that you want to be able to fine-tune the model with relatively little data on specific downstream tasks later on, whether that's building a chatbot, doing market analysis, an AI tutor, whatever. The important discovery that has come in AI in the last few years is that it is possible to pre-train in a task agnostic manner and to still see good downstream training on novel tasks with relatively little data, hence the phrase fine-tuning. That is the key to a foundation model. Now, why does this work? The reason is that pre-training, when done appropriately, when selecting the right loss, gives you latent representations that captured the shared information in the data. Now, and this is not to pick on you, Adam, but I want to return to something you said in your question. Sometimes when you do multitask training in a model, you will see some kind of antagonism between the representations. And we've certainly seen that in some of our work. Depending upon the way that you set it up, you might just throw two different losses on your neural network, and you'll find that they actually battle against each other and in fact inhibit one another. And you end up getting worse performance as a result of training on two rather than one task. But if you do the pre-training well, basically it comes down to there's an art to it. Now, unfortunately, you know, deep learning is more of an art than a science. And there's a sort of subtle dark art to it where you've got to figure out the right losses, the right architectures, the right way of structuring your data and tokenizing it, et cetera. But when you get it right, you can indeed learn latent representations that are very good, general purpose latent representations that capture information about a wide swath of diverse data. And in general, the deeper layers of your model are going to capture the more universal components of your diverse data sets. So this is why it would be good to do for neuroscience data as well. My dream here, and the dream of many others, is that we would not train an artificial neural network on specific tasks for neural data, but instead we would train on a whole host of different modalities, data from different species, from brain regions, from individuals doing different behaviors, seeing different stimuli, basically zero constraints on the nature of the data ingested. Just give us all the data, feed it into the model. And if the pre-training is done well, we should be able to then fine-tune for all sorts of downstream tasks, whether that be, you know, clinical applications. You know, this slide was originally made for maybe a more applications-focused audience, but you could imagine having good latent representations that tell you things like, okay, here, these are the distinctions between different types of depression. Like when we feed in activity from different people who are both diagnosed with depression, the latent representations will actually capture the distinctions such that you could make good predictions about whether or not they would respond to SSRIs or ketamine better, for example. Or, of course, you could get better brain-computer interfaces. You could imagine training across a wide number of different data sets, and then being able to fine-tune with just a few minutes of data from an individual to get good accuracy. So that's the kind of high level answer to the question. But I want to, oh, and this is just further emphasizing that. I think I'm going to skip through this. But I want to get back to, so I've already given you my hand wavy answer. And so now I want to get even a little bit more concrete about the answer here, because I think that sometimes this is something that is not always well articulated. I've said it, but I'm going to say it again. So deep learning is fundamentally about representation learning. Let's be clear about this. The entire purpose of moving from the sorts of models that we used in machine learning in the early 2000s to deep neural networks was to learn our representations. When I was an undergraduate student, kernel methods were all the rage. It was what everyone did in machine learning. And the whole point of kernel methods was, you don't have to learn your representations. So you pick good kernels, you bootstrap off the data a little bit, and great, Bob's your uncle, you're ready to fly, you're going to do optimization with good guarantees about convergence and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, we discovered that actually representations really matter. There's a reason that deep neural networks beat out kernel methods on a variety of domains, and that was they learn their representations, and the learned representations can be more efficacious for all sorts of downstream things. This is sort of the classic visual example with image categorization, but I think it's good for sake of intuition building, right? So you've all seen this kind of stuff, but let's just be clear on it. You might receive data that is all mixed and jumbled up. So if I give you images of cats and dogs and I ask you to classify it into cats and dogs, the problem is that at the pixel level, the inputs that you receive are ultimately all jumbled up. The similarity in pixel space between an image of a cat and a dog is not a nice cluster between cats and dogs. There are some cats that at the pixel level look a lot more like a dog than other cats. What your deep neural network ultimately does for you is it gives you representations that make it easier to do this classification. And that representation learning is the core of deep learning. This is actually a quote from the deep learning book from Bengio, Goodfellow, and Corville. Generally speaking, a good representation is one that makes a subsequent learning task easier. The choice of representation will usually depend on the choice of the subsequent learning task. Now, I've highlighted that because they said this in 2017 before the foundation model era had arrived in AI. And effectively, the lesson that we have now learned is that you can remove that usually. You can basically just say the choice of representation need not depend on the choice of the subsequent task. And that is the key insight. Now, so we want good latent representations. This is the point. This is the entire point of it, is good latent representations of neural data. We want things that carve up the brain's data into natural kinds, as it were. But there are two reasons we're going to need to do this in a multitask fashion, I think. Because to be clear, you can get good representations on a single task. That's what they do with image categorization systems. But the reason we want multitask in neuroscience is twofold. The first is that neural data is highly variable. And the bitter lesson, which I won't re-articulate because Eva and Mehdi and stuff have already talked about it, the bitter lesson tells us we're going to need to get scale. We've seen that in AI repeatedly. And when it comes to something like image categorization, you can get good scale. There are huge data sets out there. People can label things for you easily. But realistically, in neural data, we're never going to get to the scale needed for a single task, ever. Like, it's just not feasible. We're going to need to collect a large collection of tasks, of data from multiple different tasks, multiple different species, multiple different modalities. Otherwise, we're just never going to actually get to the scale of data we want. So there's just that practical thing. We don't have enough labeled data to do this properly. We need to do task agnostic training. The second is that I think the latents would really provide good windows into the actual structure of the brain that would then make subsequent analyses easier. So here, for this claim, I'm basically saying that you can imagine that for any individual brain, you have unique dynamics. And relating those dynamics between different brains is very hard. It's almost like every brain is talking its own language. It has its own lexicon. But what we want to do is we want to identify the shared computational dynamics across brains. And to do that, I think, again, you need to employ a foundation model approach. Now, let me give you an example here. So we recently did a study. This is just early days. You know, they showed you those plots of the models increasing in scale, but honestly, that's going to end up being the bottom left corner of our plots 10 years from now. And so we're still in the bottom left corner, but let me show you an example of what that bottom left corner can still do. And here my point is going to be about the structures of representation we see in the latents. So we recently published a paper, well, I guess it's now online, but it's not officially out yet because iClear hasn't happened yet, but it's a spotlight at this year's iClear, led by Mehdi, and that I did with Mehdi and Eva and a student of mine, Crystal. And so what we did is we wanted to train a multitask decoder model from the Allen Observatory dataset. So I'm sure most of you know this data set, so I won't belabor the point, but basically it was a large calcium imaging data set where they presented mice with various different stimuli, drifting grading, static grading, sparse noise, natural scenes, natural movies, and then just gray screens. They collected data from a few different visual cortex regions, including higher order visual regions, and they did so across a variety of Cree lines. So there were in total, I think, I don't want to spend time counting these bars here, but I think it was 13 different Cree lines, including both inhibitory and excitatory Cree lines, and data from each of these Cree lines was collected across multiple brain regions, all 6 of the visual brain regions. Now, we built on our POYO model, which you've already heard about. The POYO model is basically a transformer model that uses a perceiver IO architecture to achieve good across individual training. And then we modified the POYO model further into a model we call POYO Plus, where we added an additional cross-attention head here, which would allow us to give query tokens for different tasks. So the point is now we're not training the model on an individual task. In this case, we're not yet doing, in this paper, self-supervised pre-training, which is the most general purpose way to approach this. And you saw some of that from Cole, and I think you're probably going to see more from others over the course of this workshop. But here, we're still doing multitask in a supervised way. We basically provide query tokens where we say, okay, here's the particular item of information we want from this session at this time. So in that way, we can ask the model, tell us what the orientation was of the drifting grading at that time based on the neural activity, or tell us what the temporal frequency was, or tell us what the pupil location was of the animal, or tell us what the running speed was of the animal, etc. So we can provide in these different queries, and it's all trained on these different tasks at once. We feed the calcium traces in directly, and we literally tokenize every time step of the calcium traces. I can talk more later about how that works if you want. But so we train this model across these different tasks. Does it work? Yes, it does. So here you can see in purple POYO Plus, which is where it's trained across all the tasks. As a comparison point, POYO here will always refer to a POYO model trained on just one task, so not training across all of the different tasks. These are some baselines for comparison, but the important point is that notice that the purple bar is always doing better than the gray bar. In other words, rather than being antagonistic, when we train the model across all the tasks, we pretty much always get a benefit in terms of our downstream decoding error compared to a model trained on a single task. So rather than being antagonistic, the tasks can actually be helpful to each other. Now, there are differing degrees of this for differing decoding tasks. So in some cases, we see nice big bumps. In some cases, it's very small. But the key point is that we're not seeing performance tank, as you do sometimes when you set up a multitask trainer in an inappropriate manner. Now, the other interesting thing, and this is what I wanted to show you, is then what happens in the latents of the model. So we went and we investigated the latents of this model to ask what sorts of structures is it learning about the brain. Now remember, all this model has seen is calcium traces, and all it's done is it's decoded a variety of stimulus or behavioral information. So that's it. We haven't provided it with any other information about the recordings other than the calcium traces and the behavioral or stimulus labels. But when we go, I'm going to skip past this. This is just the table for the ML reviewers where you get your bold things. You see, we're good. Okay, so I need to wrap up. When we look at the latents, what we see that's really interesting is that they carry information about the brain regions and the cell types, even though we didn't tell the model anything about that. So here, what you're looking at is if we take the latents and we decode just with a linear decoder, what is the brain region we were recording from? With the multitask model, we get much better decoding performance than we get from just training off of the actual data itself or training off the single task model. So that's because the latents in the multitask model actually have captured something about brain regions. It's carved the representations up into distinct representations for different brain regions, even though it learned nothing about that in terms of the labels that it provided. Here you can see the confusion matrix for the classification of brain regions. And so largely it's, along the diagonal because it's doing a good job. But some brain regions are more similar to one another, depending on the latents. And in fact, what's interesting is those similarities reflect the anatomy. So when you do hierarchical clustering on the latents for data from the different brain regions, the lateral regions cluster in one area and the medial regions cluster in a different area. We told the model nothing about anatomy. That just comes out of training on the dynamics. This is where representations matter in deep learning. They tell you something about the data. We see a similar thing with cell types. So when you look at the latents for data for different cell types, if you do dimensionality reduction on it, inhibitory and excitatory cells cluster distinctly. And you can classify which Cree line you're looking at right away with a linear decoder on the latents. But again, the model knew nothing about different Cree lines. That just comes out of the data of training on the multitask sessions. And when we do this hierarchical clustering on the case of the Cree lines, not only, of course, do we see the excitatory and inhibitory lines clustering, but what's neat is you also see the different projection types of neurons clustering. So intratelencephalic, pyramidal tract, and cortical thalamic neurons all clustered distinctly in the latents. So the model really is learning something about the structure of the brain from the multitask training. This is the direction I want to keep pushing on over the next 10 years. I want to see us get really, really good latents for representing neural data across any task you give me. Now, wrapping up, what I'm not arguing, because look, a lot of people misinterpret what I'm proposing, and there are certain themes in the misinterpretations, and I want to nip this in the bud. Number one, I'm not implying that the brain works like a large transformer. A lot of people, I don't know why this is the go-to. I've never said anything like this in my life, but they see, oh, you're training a large transformer on brain data, so you think the brain's like a transformer? No, I'm not saying that. That's not the point. Second, I'm not suggesting that that a neural foundation model would emulate the brain at a mechanistic level. So I'm not saying, for example, that within those latents, different cell types are interacting in the same way that cell types interact in the real brain. That's not the point. I'm just saying we've got good latent representations that carve up the cell types, for example. As to whether or not the model exhibits anything that looks like the real interactions between cell types in it, I don't know. That's TBD. This is not a claim about any kind of mechanistic level modeling. I'm not proposing that a neural foundation model would absolve us of the need to do hypothesis-driven research. I'm not saying understanding comes for free. I'm not saying we just throw all the data at the model and then it spits out the answer 42 and we're done for the day and great. That is not the claim either. And I'm not claiming, so this dives into it. So one way of articulating what I'm saying is not that it would give us some kind of magic understanding of the brain, but rather it would provide us with a host of tools for research in neurotech, because we'd have good latent representations of neural data that we could use for a variety of downstream applications. The analogy I think is good is Deep Lab Cut. Deep Lab Cut was basically just a pre-trained neural network that you could fine tune on a variety of different behavioral tasks. And this is what I'm saying we could get for neural representations, but on steroids. So that's it. We can now peer into brains with ever more sophisticated technology. I think it's time to use modern AI tools to do this as effectively as possible. Thanks a lot.